This is the Last Sip Memorial Day edition. We're talking with Rashad Robinson of Color of Change about mobilizing for collective action. So to the degree that we've allowed corporations to grow and power in the United States, it may be one of the reasons why challenges around race and racism are new. So I want to hear your thoughts about that. And you've mentioned that ALEC plays a role in that. And I'm wondering if you can take a minute to explain what ALEC is.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think, just kind of in your comments that you're saying, is that there's an entire infrastructure that resists change around race and racism, right?
Yeah.
And that it works in cohort, and that at the center of that, again, is corporate money and power that's influencing, that's funding. If you look at the Koch brothers, right?
Yeah.
They're funding the organizations that you mentioned. They were big proponents of ALEC. They fund an entire right-wing media organization. They fund candidates. So there's an entire infrastructure at which corporate power and corporate money is present. And I think that most people don't think about the role that corporations play in race and racism in the United States.
Yep. So, one of the reasons why is when Color of Change was founded, we made a strategic decision not to accept any money from corporations or government. We're the only national black civil rights organization in the country that does not take corporate money. And that, in many ways, also gives us a level of go-to-market strategy and freedom to run the type of unapologetic campaigns on corporations. But you're absolutely right. It does come down to a set of rules that have been changed. It's not just that corporations are not as incentivized as government to, without rules, to deal with diversity. It's that they work through their tax policies and tax practices to actually deregulate. And so issues like the housing crisis of '08 that basically wiped out about 75% of black wealth. Black people were buying homes, and those homes were sort of people's pathway to from poverty to working class to middle class. They were leveraging those homes to send children to school, to retire, a whole host of things. And it was absolutely wiped out by deregulation and choices that big banks could make. The only people that really went to jail off of that were protesters in the Occupy movement, not any of the bankers who stole black wealth. But since 1980, this has been an ongoing project of the right. Corporations and government colluded. And ALEC is really at the center of so much of that. They bring corporations and government leaders behind closed doors. And for the last 40 plus years, they've done this, and they basically write what they call model legislation that's in the interest of these corporations. And then the state legislators who are sort of at these fancy gatherings go back home to their states and introduce this legislation, and legislation to advance more private prisons, legislation to make it harder to vote, legislation that makes it harder to organize in the workplace, that makes it harder to have your student debt forgiven, a whole host of laws that empower corporations and make it harder for people to actually climb up the economic ladder, that basically freezes the status quo and then allows them to make more. Right. Since 1980, income inequality has risen. So there was the last time that black and white wealth income was closing. And this is not a question about black people stopped working hard in 1980.
Right.
This is not a
The
question.
rules changed.
The rules changed.
Yeah.
And so, but because a lot of people, like I said, see inequality is unfortunate rather than unjust, then the solutions become mentorship programs, or like we need to just volunteerism. I go out to Hollywood and I challenge Hollywood around the fact that there's structural exclusion to their writers' rooms, and they're like, maybe we should just go to high schools and tell these kids that these jobs are for them. I'm like, no, there are like black writers I know in Hollywood being excluded right now. Like there are people who are not getting in the door right now, and so part of that has been a project by corporations. And even with big diversity initiatives that don't actually deal with rule changes, what we are doing is sort of like taping over the problem, and then we don't get the actual types of changes because racism is a shapeshifter. And if we don't actually change the rules And if we don't actually then enforce those rules and stay vigilant about the rules, the poll taxes of the 60s become the voter ID laws of the 2000s. Jim Crow becomes mass incarceration, even with rules. And so without rules, we actually end up with something much worse. We end up with structural and systemic exclusion.